welcome to this celebration and conversation about Professor Ananya Chatterjea's prodigious new book, Heat and Alterity in Contemporary Dance, South-South Choreographies. I am Carl Flink, the director of the University of Minnesota Dance Program. Our program's mission is the preparation of thinking dancers and dancing thinkers through the lens of contemporary dance in global contexts. As many of you already know, Ananya is quite literally the embodiment of that vision in her research and practice. I want to specifically welcome the Palgrave McMillan series editors Rachel Fincham and Kate Ellswit from the New World Choreographies series, and acknowledge and thank our ASL interpreters Hercules Goss and Steve Train for their support of today's event. Our originally scheduled moderator, Professor Talvin Wilkes, needed to withdraw for personal health reasons. We thank him for his support of this event and send him our thoughts for health and wellness. Be well, Talvin. I will now introduce our new facilitator and longtime dance program friend, Thomas DeFrantz, to frame and lead the discussion of Ananya's book. Professor DeFrantz directs Slippage, Performance, Culture, Technology. He received the 2017 Outstanding Research in Dance Award from the Dance Studies Association and is a professor of dance and African studies at Duke University. He believes in our shared capacity to do better and to engage our creative spirit for a collective good that is anti-racist, anti-homophobic, proto-feminist, and queer-affirming. Some other highlights include being consultant for the Smithsonian Museum of African American Life and Culture, the installation on Black social dance that opened with the museum in 2016, and founding the Collegium for African Diaspora Dance. Tommy is an innovator and leader in our truly global field of dance. Welcome, Tommy.
Thank you so much. I begin with a candle to mark the beginning of our encounter together. I broadcast from a laboratory on the unceded ancestral lands of the Shakori, the Ino, and the Tuscarora people. I bring to our encounter the memories of many years of working alongside Ananya Chatterjea, the author and maker and thinker whose work we celebrate today, and also my grandmother, who was a dancer. And when I was a little boy, I would ask her how she was doing, and she would say, "Still kicking, not high." It's a pleasure to moderate this event, and an even greater pleasure to introduce Ananya Chatterjea. Ananya's work as a choreographer, dancer, and thinker brings together contemporary dance, social justice choreography, and a philosophy of #OccupyDance. She is, of course, artistic director of Ananya Dance Theater, a Twin Cities-based professional dance company of BIPOC women, Womenex, and Femmes, and a co-founder of the Shangram Institute for Performance and Social Justice. Ananya received a 2011 Guggenheim Choreography Fellowship, a 2012 McKnight Choreography Fellowship, a 2015 Sage Outstanding Dance Educator Award, a 2016 Joyce Foundation Award, a 2018 Urban Bush Women Choreographic Fellowship, and a 2019 Dance USA Artist Fellowship. In response to Twin Cities Uprising of last year, 2020, she created the Kantamkari Relationship Making Healing Movement, a series with particular invitation to BIPOC women and femme healers. Her second book, Heat and Alterity in Contemporary Dance, South-South Choreographies, reframes understandings of contemporary dance from the perspective of choreographers from South-South communities, and was published in fall 2020. We gather to celebrate this achievement and to relaunch the ideas of this incredible creative and intellectual exercise into the world. Ananya Chatterjea has been a friend for many years, and it is an honor to turn our attention to her now and her embodied land acknowledgement.
We begin by paying homage to the Dakota Oyate and Anishinaabe peoples. We take 6 steps. Greet the sky, greet this land. Hold this up. Mini Shota Makoche. Connect to our circle. Zagi, 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 love. To the earth, Zagi Dwim, and together affirm our relationality, Mitakuye Oasin. Back to Tommy.
With so much pleasure and an opening of heart. Our task today is a very happy one, and it is to celebrate the achievement of this publication. I've been lucky enough to think alongside Ananya for many years now, and so it is no surprise to me that this book lands with so much energetic force and urgent appeal to the moment we share now, but also to the possibilities of advanced research in dance and access for so many of us to concepts of the contemporary. Our format today will be an assemblage of really incredible thinkers who have agreed to gather and share insights into this text and its implications. Conversation, of course, with the author. And I have the pleasure of introducing all of our event with some ideas of my own, if you don't mind. So we'll hear from the gathered thinkers in response to the event. And then we'll definitely have time to take some questions, of course, from people who are viewing wherever you are on the planet and in your lives. So we'll have time for that at the end of the event. Whew, this text, Ananya, wow. For me, there are several strands that I want to bring forward as the kind of pivots that help me rethink possibilities in relationships to dance and people's commitment to dance as a strategy, as a healing technology, and as a mechanism of group kinship. I think your work in this text reminds us to consider the terms that tend to surround how we gather through what we call contemporary dance or through experimental performance and its possibilities. You challenge us to rethink and to be intentional about our thinking through as we experience choreography, performance, dance, and social justice movements One aspect that encourages me to no end has to do with how this text characterizes the avant-garde as a site of whiteness. One of the things that I think the text does so incredibly well is remind us that the possibilities of future thinking, being, doing, making are not only to be the province of whiteness, that we will urgently need to find ways to understand and appreciate our doing and making as artists of color, as witnesses of color, as audiences and interested dancers of color, to be aligned with experimentation and an emergent avant-garde. You, in this text, help us rethink the contemporary, which is too often defined as the space beyond race. So somehow in the contemporary, we are de facto beyond race. Race stops operating in some weird future where the avant-garde is always white. Your research and your scholarship do not allow this. You remind us that we are, as BIPOC artists and people committed to Black life and Black love, we are engaged in experimentation. We are urgently bound up in the sites of the contemporary, and we are working in the spaces of an avant-garde. Thank you for this. You also, in this text, demonstrate a social justice-based approach to experimentation. And this labor is done by looking at the work of several artists of color who are working in the space of performance experimentation as an outcome of a commitment to social justice possibilities. In some ways, this text lines up social justice and experimentation with the practices of contemporary dance in ways that, again, reorient us towards our shared capacity to do better. Social justice might be a way of imagining towards shared possibility alongside access to clean water, the deployment of food so that we resist living in food deserts. Social justice is about everyday activity, and it can be lined up, and often is lined up, with experimental artistry. You remind us that no is something we can give. Sometimes we need to give it to each other. Sometimes, and more often, we need to give it to structures of white supremacy. And a no is something that we can give in our encounters that will actually help us, at many times, do better. And finally, I'm super excited about how you demonstrate heat as a productive capacity of attunement and transfiguration. In Africanist aesthetics, we talk about cool an awful lot. And your text and its thinking through of heat as a pivot or a mode of engagement reminds us that hot matters too, that being hot might be a recognizable place of engaging experiment. And it matters that we recognize how we can get hot in order to create a shared capacity for social change, to enhance a feminist possibility that features, centers, and privileges BIPOC femmes, and that allows us to engage a kind of celebration of our ability to generate heat as a mode of transference and transfiguration. Ananya, I'm going to invite you back into this conversation for a little bit before we hear from our gathered guests. And I wonder if you want to offer some of the imagery of some of the choreographers that you discuss in this text, and also offer us some ways that you're thinking about your work now that the book is actually launched. So please join us again.
Thank you so much, Tommy, for your beautiful reading. You are my friend, my fellow journeyer, and my sibling of many lives. So I'm grateful to you. I want to say that this is a remarkable moment in my life because I feel like two things are coming together. I taught yesterday at the Embodied Social Justice Summit, and the book launch is happening today. It seems that there is no other way to work. There is, I'm committed, and the universe is making sure I remember it, that this is the place from which to dance. This is the place from which to look at, think about, and celebrate dance. And I just want to say that I had to begin by looking at the South-South axis, the artists from the Global South, and artists who are working in Global South modalities, and artists in the diasporic South here, who are both pushing back against white notions of innovation and against the grandstanding narratives of tradition. And when I looked at their work, maybe we can look at some of those images. So here I started with the brilliant Mama Germaine Acogny. And here are some images of Mama Germaine, just to locate us in time and place. Here she is teaching. This is from one of the works that I talk about in the book. In her beloved École des Sables in Toubab Diallo, Senegal. Moving on to Sardono Kusumo. This is Sardono Kusumo working in an abandoned sugar mill. A performance about refugeeism. This is from Black Sun, which is also about peoples, abandoned peoples, abandoned by the nation states from which they draw their citizenship. Moving on to Nora Chipaumire. Here is Nora working in a schoolhouse in Dakar. This is in, I don't remember where exactly this is, but I think it's in Burkina Faso, actually. And then her research on running and walking. And this is from that brilliant piece, Portrait of Myself as My Father, which left us all really gasping for breath. Moving on to Rulan Tangen, who has worked so often inside contexts that we think of our nature, but really she's reminding us of the symbiotic relationship with our ecologies, and her use of fabric often or other tools to create this epicness of indigenous life. I also looked at the work of Lemi Ponifasion, who reminds us that dance just is connecting to the core issues inside dance. It's from a work I talk about in the book. This image inspired by birds carrying bits of cassette tapes in their beaks, abandoned on the beach. Camille, this is Prumsodun OK, who is known for creating the first queer Cambodian dance company, but it's amazing how his reimagination of tradition happens on feminized but male-identified bodies, male-presenting bodies. Teaching, here he is teaching. And his TED Talk, where he reminded us about all the multiplicities that he's bringing together in his reclaiming of classical Khmer dance. Camille Brown needs no introduction. Amazing work in holding up what Amy Cox, brilliant scholar, has reminded us of the missing middle in the lives of Black girls and young Black women. And Alice Sheppard, my friend Alice Sheppard, who is reminding us and holding us accountable to thinking about disability as the starting point of an aesthetic, not an accommodation. Alice's work is always reminding us also at the beauty and power of dance. She loves it, and she reminds us of the many ways in which we dance. Dance is multiple. I love these artists, and they reminded me oftentimes when I would get stuck that I have to keep on writing because this work deserves the attention. They also, in writing about them, I also had to address what I think is shorthand among many BIPOC communities, what we call white dance, which is not dance performed by white bodies, but a way of dancing, a way of connecting to the world. What matters? How do we show up in the dance? How do we circulate in the dance? And also they reminded me that dance was so much, as Thelma Golden reminds us, that what is called post-Black is not at all the same thing, is quite entirely different from post-race. So we are post certain constrictive ways of looking at identities, but we are completely culturally located. All of these artists remind us of that. Thank you, Tommy, for inviting me to just offer a few thoughts. Inviting you back on.
Thank you. It's beautiful, and we'll bring in some of our gathered thinkers to share some ideas about work and its implications. And we'll begin with Ananya Jahanara Kabir, who is professor of English literature at King's College London. Before King, she taught at the universities of Leeds and Cambridge, as well as the UC Berkeley. She researches the intersection of the written text with other forms of cultural expression within acts of memorialization and forgetting. In recent years, issues around the market and cultural heritage join her earlier interests in the relationship of creativity to conflict. Through an advanced grant from the ERC, she led an interdisciplinary investigation into African heritage, social dance, and music across language worlds. She is the author of Paradise, Death, and Doomsday in Anglo-Saxon Literature, also of Territory of Desire, representing the Valley of Kashmir, also Partitions, Post-Amnesias, 1947, 1971, and Modern South Asia. She's currently writing Allegro Politics, Connecting on the Afro-Modern Dance Floor, and her new research project, Creole Indias, explores transoceanic creolization through cultural production, connecting the Atlantic and Indian Ocean worlds. Professor Kabir, Ananya, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much, friends. It's a real pleasure and honor to be here. Such a gracious introduction from a colleague we deeply admire, and to serve my role in launching this book of another colleague we also admire. I'm very, very happy and proud to be here with my namesake celebrating her new book. Just a question, can I be heard? Because I've stopped hearing a little echo on my part, but does that mean I am still audible for the world? Thank you.
You can be heard perfectly well, thank you.
We never know with technology of this kind whether we are speaking to ourselves or to all of us, but I'm glad I'm still audible. So yes, this is, in my opinion, really a fantastic book, just the kind of book that people like me, you know, Tommy, that was a very gracious introduction. Some people might really wonder how I've managed to, you know, move wildly from field to field in the course of my career. You know, different periods of history as well as different kinds of modes of cultural expression. Well, it's because of colleagues such as Ananya Chatterjea, such as yourself, people who've written sensitively and rigorously and helped the rest of us step into new areas so that we don't have to worry. We can hit the ground running because you write these books for us. You express yourselves in a way that others can not just understand where you're coming from, but also try to join that journey somewhere. So I do see my relationship with different forms of Black dance, a journey in which I, as an Indian woman, tried to unlearn many prejudices, many problems, many impossibilities, many imprisonings within a certain kind of, socialized body that is mine. And it has been a journey of in a way, solidarity and learning about cultures and peoples and emotions and histories that colonization, I'm afraid, really often prevented us from knowing about. So it's the South-South solidarity that your book talks about, not just through discourse, but through bodies moving together, generating certain affects, which you call heat. The heat, which is both a product of alterity and answers back to it. It's that sort of solidarity that I myself was kind of trying to find my way, towards when I embarked on my own dance project, which indeed got me in contact with people gathered here today at this wonderful event. And of course, I must say here, of course, that Ananya Chatterjea and I, she's my Ononna Di, she's the older Ononna, she's my senior way back when from Presidency College, Calcutta. We hold people like her in great esteem because they really opened up pathways for us. So thank you for showing us the way. We try our best to join in this journey with you. So let me say a few words then about this book. We will have a lot of opportunity to talk about it together as a group, so I will keep my remarks short. I found very compelling in the book the combination of the first few chapters that were, I wouldn't say they were theoretical because that's too abstract. They were literally telling us like it is. There were sections on things like footwork and connecting to the floor and body language and kind of how one holds the body and moves in space, which was the way one could understand that what we were talking about, the not white dance, all the other kinds of dance practices that are in the world. So I very much appreciated the fact that there were a few chapters that eased us into into the work of choreography that we would then come across, from the third chapter onwards. But I think that's very important, that there's a scaffolding, if you like, is erected for us to kind of really grasp what those what the actual, the luminaries the amazing dancers, the choreographers, the people that you then focus on, we kind of understand a bit better because those initial chapters, I think, give us that common vocabulary to get what they're doing. And I think this makes the book also an extremely important book for that interdisciplinary move, because different people can read it and understand what is it we're meant to take away from then the actual descriptions and analysis and presentations of the figures that follow. And of course, these figures that populate the work, and I'm so glad you showed the images before, because those images brought them to life as much as we can imagine their bodies moving in space. They were a really important reminder. of how they chose to present themselves as embodied and performing people on stages, but also in the kind of like space of their own lives and their own growth. So those images were really important, and they corresponded to each chapter that that are dedicated to each of them. And they really make for very compelling and mesmerizing reading. They're like, it's like reading a novel about these people and their journeys. And of course, you yourself undertook many journeys in tracking them. So I think the book is excitingly allows us a glimpse of that process as well. So it's really a book full of riches in an empirical way, as well as in a kind of theoretical way. But what's I think very important for me to take away, of course, when I read the chapter on Germaine Acogny, Madame Acogny, I was very, very, I was very nostalgic for the eye-opening and beautiful moments I spent on my research work in different parts of West Africa. Senegal, in fact, was the first African country I ever visited in any part of the continent. So it brought a lot of things back to me. But moving further and, going to Cambodia, Indonesia, back to Zimbabwe, I mean, these journeys, what were they for me but an instantiation of what Tommy, described as my new project now, this idea of trying to connect the Atlantic and Indian Ocean worlds. The South-South connections we talk about then in your book are, of course, through bodies, but they're also, I think they help us try to get at this geographical histories of South-South solidarity. What are the spaces we traverse? What are the cultural worlds that we're immersed in? And of course, the Atlantic and the Indian Ocean worlds are both, that's what my research taught me. Particularly if you look at the history of dance in these worlds, there's a kind of convergence as well as a divergence. And I think your book gives us material to track those connections so that we can conceptualize solidarity itself better. Then I think finally, I really like the element of the two comments that you raised, the two ways you described a couple of your choreographers, radical juxtaposition and generative pollution. I'm hoping that we can talk about these comments later, because I think these are going to help us also think about what we do when we encounter people trying to connect with each other. So I'm going to end there. Thank you again for this amazing book, and I'm looking forward to everybody's conversation about it after I stop. Thanks.
Beautiful, Professor Kabir. Thank you so much. And I think what we'll do is we'll go on to Professor Kearney and hear their remarks. Douglas Kearney has published 6 books, including the award-winning poetry collection Buck Studies, Libretti, Someone Took They Tongues, and Criticism, Mess and Mess and. His newest collection of poems, Show, will be out in 2021. Whiting Writers and Foundation for Contemporary Art Cy Twomley awardee with residencies and fellowships from Cave Canem, the Rauschenberg Foundation, and others. Kearney teaches creative writing at the University of Minnesota, Twin Cities. Professor?
Thank you. Thank you very much for that introduction, Tommy. And congratulations, Ananya. And I'm very honored to be here. I'll get to my remarks. The heat. Kikongo Lufuki, from which some figure the term funk comes, there in Lufuki's crossroads of body odor as in sweat, and giving high praise. I mean to mean that in seeking heat as a metric and presence of the South-South, there is a funk, heat and alterity. A funk that it seeks in the sense that this is a book about work and thus sweat. This is labor done in praise of labor, that which is visible and rendered invisible, exemplified by, say, Rosie Simas, whose choreography, social justice work, and challenges to settlerism, even in the theaters that claim the contemporary, Professor Chatterjea celebrates. Throughout my reading, I thought of funk, its capacity to consider freedom through movement, its call to movement and dance, its embrace of heat and closeness, as in that which refuses distance and the senses that opens. In that heat, that heat, that heat, that heat, the sweat that messes white dance, a dance with an epistemology of wanting to be clean, to wash its hands of, to leave what's already been grasped, suddenly untouched, an activity of alibi, a choreography of escape without surrender or withdrawing power, only of flesh under a hot light, more search than spot removed. An attempt to be traceless, no movement making contact. Heat as the product of friction, as the product of movement, of proximity. These sum up to a number of intimacies, eros and eris, for sure, as a grind is both a dance and a thing done to make flesh more consumable and incoherent. Ananya Chatterjea mines the fire, thinking through it and stoking it, an energy source and mode of pressure and transfer. Throughout my reading, I remained struck by Professor Chatterjea's construction, a climate. As a climate signifying metonym for the global South-South, an amplification that reminds me of US America's South, the dirty, dirty, funky, I contrast Chatterjea's heat as a convection in the proscenium, convection, not confection, set to rise over what is cool, chilled in the air-conditioned theater. Not to provide it sweet, but heat. That is to say, what is not a warm body is cadaverous in the cavernous stage's space, a vault for stashing riches and corpses. Heat brings in sand and dirt. That which Toni Morrison's Claudia uses to mark her body in the bluest eye. That which Germaine Acogny builds movement from, spreading mess into the temple. This is the generative pollution Professor Chatterjea formulates, one where Mary Douglas's definition of garbage as matter out of place reaches a point of friction and ignition. Who's in whose place? Who and what don't belong? In this funk, I think of that which transgresses a formulation of the properties of propriety. This made me think of Toni Morrison again. Quote, the careful development of thrift, patience, high morals, and good manners. In short, how to get rid of the funkiness of passion, the funkiness of nature, the funkiness of a wide range of emotion, end quote, writes Morrison in The Bluest Eye, of the readying of Mrs. Breedlove to serve as a respectable woman an example. Respectable to whom? And an example for what end? Now, throughout the text, Professor Chatterjea returns to the formation of the idea of metaphor. Now, perhaps as a poet, I feel particularly interested in this. If we take metaphor, perhaps one of two most familiar structures of juxtaposition in English poetry, we might employ critic I.A. Richards' concept of tenor and vehicle to some useful effect. Tenor, for Richards, being the thing meant, and vehicle being the thing that bears the weight of the comparison. My own skepticism towards literary metaphor is deeply challenged in really productive ways through Professor Chatterjea's text in Heat and Alterity. And one question that I hope we're able to speak to is, what is the difference between a lexical metaphor and an embodied metaphor? How does metaphor operate in dance in ways that might be instructive to literature? Thank you.
Terrific for us, Professor. Thank you so much. There are so many ideas already flowing among the two presentations that we've heard. And we'll move into a third presentation now. We'll hear from dancer scholar Alessandra Williams, an assistant professor of dance at Rutgers, New Brunswick. Her research interests include dance and performance, Asian and African diasporas, transnational feminism, and queer of color theory. As an artist in Ananya Dance Theater, Williams has performed nationally and internationally in 8 of the company's productions. Alongside Ananya Chatterjea and Hui Wilcox, she has co-edited their forthcoming book, yes, another offering, Dancing Transnational Feminisms, Artistic Excellence and Social Justice in Ananya Dance Theater, which will come out later this year. Currently, she also has a solo-authored book project on the queer of color choreography of David Rusev and the Reality Dance Company. Williams has also completed an Inclusive Excellence Fellowship at the University of Wisconsin-Whitewater, and as Eugene V. Cotto-Robles Fellow, she earned the Culture and Performance PhD at UCLA. Professor Williams?
Thank you. Thank you. I am with you, Ananya Chatterjea, in your daily practice of Vinyasa Yoga, where we repeatedly find ourselves in the Samastiti position, accomplished by centering our weight on equally grounded feet, where we are pondering the application of this practice, knowing that the ground under our feet is rent with unevenness, where we question the fictional ideology that somehow we exist on the same neutral ground, where we wrestle with the location of whiteness inhabiting the central space in contemporary dance without ever having to mark its own cultural lineage. As we stand with our feet together, searching for the placement of our toes, heels, insides, and edges of our feet on the ground, this is symbolic, and it is the material of our work as South-South artists, sharing a grounding, not one restricted to geography, but one that moves through the prismatic politics of critiquing interlocking oppressive hierarchies. I am ready to apply this daily practice, to transform the heat of anger into generative heat. I know that a student in my classroom is searching for words, grasping for understanding, managing the fire of their own discomfort when they hold up our national treasures like Alvin Ailey as examples of our living in a post-racial world. In these heated moments, it feels like disregard, a deflating of our conversations on dance and the intersection of oppressions on the basis of gender and race. But these are transformative moments, opportunities to break through that fiction of same ground and step into the South-South practice of being aware of how inclusion doesn't necessarily significantly rearrange relations of power. And it is so hot up in here because these labors, these tensions we hold are so much. How do we account for the additional and uncompensated emotional organizing and physical labor that South-South artists often have to take on continually in order to make space for their work to be seen in their own terms? Ask Chatterjea when examining how Native artist Rosie Simas had to intervene in the ongoing erasure and appropriation of Native presence in contemporary performance. How many of us have had to do that work of intervening, of identifying that problem in the room that people are afraid to speak to, or do not yet have the tools to comprehend? But who are the theoretical soldiers in your corner who have your back when you're trying to find your balance in it? Who give you the language to understand that your work is, in fact, surplus labor? The work South-South artists take on to reveal the veiled conceptual and infrastructural inequities inside the circuits of funding, curating, and producing contemporary dance. Inhale. Exhale. I am in the practice. I am finding ground. Which dancers are with us in this practice? For as Chatterjea explains, the heat from necessary contestation can be exhausting, Any participation within global stage circuitries, given previous histories, will demand vigilance and negotiation. Which educators will join us in critiquing our practices, even as we stand here together in the flow of our vinyasa breath? Given that the inclusion of yoga and contemporary dance has happened with a concomitant erasure of some of the material differences of that practice. Which artists will be rigorous in technique while deconstructing the formalized aesthetics of traditional practice in our context? Which dance scholars are willing to refine this generative heat to acknowledge how artists invited to represent tradition are nudged away from the political edges of contemporary dance? Inhale, exhale. Bring your navel to your spine. Relax the shoulders down your back. Hold no tension in your jaw. Let the tongue release from the top of your mouth. Hear Chatterjee's words. These moments of unmeeting, the subtly played exclusions crackle with electric charge and tension and flush my body with heat. Remember, she reminds herself to walk slow.
Oh my goodness. I had to take a breath, many breaths. Oh my goodness. I think we now invite the five of us to be in conversation through some of the ideas that we've shared. And we'll see if the wondrous people backstage on this Vimeo broadcast can bring us all five into conversation. I'm not sure, but I am appreciative of everything they're doing, helping us find our way towards each other.
Here we are.
I guess I'd like to start, Professor Williams, with you with this idea of coming towards each other. And Ananya Chatterjea, there's so much around this scholarship and this thinking and making that is about a kind of coming together. And we just heard Professor Williams offer a very elegant way to think about that as being about breath and heat and possibility. And sometimes we say things with very simple language, like coming together, even as we understand that the actuality of that possibility is quite complex. Let's start there, though. What is it for us to come together in BIPOC femme formations and in South-South alliance without necessarily needing to reference the stuff that seems to surround us?
Mm-hmm. I think it has so much to do with that heat. In my work with Ananya Dance Theater as an artist, our coming together across our cultural, ethnic, racial, gender, sexual differences is heat, because there can be no assumptions about how we as an ensemble move together and bring our stories together and are guided by Ananya in that work. It's the heat and sweat of dancing, and it's the heat of figuring out how our stories align. And so I think that part of why I'm inspired with Ananya's text to begin applying it immediately is because so many of us as South-South artists have been yearning for this type of writing and for this type of language to explain the work that we're doing, to explain our artistic labor and how it goes silenced as we continue to intervene in contemporary dance, that we've been yearning for this, and that yearning is heat. And so for me, I'm ready, and I need to apply it. I'm ready. The heat is already in me. I'm ready, and I need this work.
It's so incredibly provocative and inspiring. So thank you for, literally bringing the heat even in this encounter. I see you there, Ananya. I want to, of course, make space for you to respond, even as we tilt back towards something that Professor Kearney had offered. But did you want to come in right now? We'd be glad to hear from you.
Thank you. I'm so grateful to everyone on this panel who has offered so much brilliance. I also want to offer a quick Can you hear?
There, you're back now.
Thank you. Now you can, okay. I wanted to say that Alessandra's, the heat that Alessandra talks about, to me, it immediately connects to the funk that Douglas talked about. The funk is painful. It's multiple ways of that, of hearing, of experiencing the cold breath that we often encounter and experience in the rejection of the ways in which we are working, the ways that we make meaning and find valuable to dance. That the funk is in the loneliness inside the work that we sometimes encounter. And the funk is incredibly productive because there is no place to hide inside the funk. So, we often say how to make something from nothing. And I think about how so many of these artists, the innovation starts in trying to make heat out of very little. There's a lot, maybe in terms, a lot of abundance. Mama Germaine talks about the sun and the sand. That is the beauty of École des Sables. But in terms of resources, there's so often so little, but they make it happen. So the funk creates a line to that incredible heat that must happen. I think that's all I have to say right now.
That's lovely, and it helps us to start to think about this concept of generative pollution. And it popped out of something that Professor Kearney offered in that, also super poetic and elegiac sort of tribute to your thinking. This idea that the funk is a place that encompasses a possibility of heat, and that generative pollution allows us also as BIPOC artists to move forward or through or among each other and the things we need to do in the world. Ananya, I don't think we can see Douglas at the same time, so maybe you could offer a kind of response to this concept of generative pollution as being a way to think towards. Or Douglas, Professor Kearney, if you could say a little bit more about this concept in relationship to funk and heat, that would be lovely.
Thank you very much. And in following Professor Kabir's mention of generative pollution, one of the things that I thought was really powerful about that notion is the idea of bringing what might be called like mess into the temple. Like, what happens when you bring something that is supposed to be outside of a system of categorization, a specific system of categorization, specific taxonomy? What happens when you bring that into a space that was restricted to it previously? How does that mirror the idea of making a place fertile? What happens when you bring the mess in? And thinking about, particularly, that was in the section of Acogny, about the sand that she trains her dancers to be on. and thinking about how that sand then moves, sort of transfers from that place to any place where that performance is metaphorically. And so thinking about generative pollution in terms of its relationship to the funk, I'm really struck by how Heat and Alterity leans into the mess that can come from maintaining alterity instead of using a different kind of heat that I think I was drawing from your discussion of the commons in white dance, which is a heat that melts and turns into a sort of a melting pot, a kind of a lack of differentiation. But that lack of differentiation is always sort of authored or authorized by the powerful, right? By dominating systems, colonialism. So I was really curious about how so much of this book works as a strategy for dealing with the mess of maintaining alterity, which I think is something else that Professor Williams brought up, Alessandra Williams brought up as well. So those are some of the thoughts that I have about generative pollution, but I'm interested in how that works across the different artists you're speaking of.
Professor Kabir, could you comment?
Point, think a little bit about one of the authors I really enjoyed reading about, the Indonesian Sardono Kusumo. I hope I'm pronouncing the name correctly, because that's in the book it follows straight after the chapter on Mama Acogny. So in a way, you'll be moving, as I said, from one oceanic space to the other, and you don't expect you think, okay, now it's Indonesia, it's a completely different sort of a setup, the colonial, post-colonial transition is different. But when I started reading that chapter, I started thinking about generative pollution in the way the relationship to the memory of the Dutch, colonial presence in the archipelago of Indonesia was figured in this in Kusumo's practice. And you had a very interesting dialogue going on there, at least in my head. I'm like, wow, so something similar is happening here. We can think about that memory, that interruption, the Dutch soldiers rushing onto stage, and even later when there's all this kind of all this kind of sardonic laughter about things that people don't get right, the turtles, you know what I'm talking about, the dollar and so anyway, all those things, which is of course, so you can see that the strategies are not dissimilar. And the strategies of resistance on the street that are then taken up on stage are not dissimilar either. But this is a way then to actually configure or enact that South-South solidarity or that South-South relation that is being postulated in the book. So for me, generative pollution definitely worked, across the board with the different artists. But, and this is the interesting thing, in a kind of meta way, it was a radical juxtaposition with each other. Do you see what I'm saying? So radical juxtaposition was a phrase that was used also in connection, I think, with Kusumo. But the way all these artists were together, generatively polluting each other's practices in the way we read them and imagined them, I think was also radical juxtaposition. This is why it's totally different to that kind of collapse that we were talking about. I think Professor Kearney, you were talking about that right now, right? Or was it, the whole, when alterity sought to become homogenized into one kind of block and melted down. So if we keep radical juxtaposition in our minds, then we kind of prevent that melting down happening, because somehow the pollution is not kind of just seeping and becoming some sort of an undistinguishable mess. The mess is actually a mess because bits are kind of not consolidating. And that's good. And a moment where I think this actually is described as happening again in the book is that discussion of the movement of the rippling spine through the grand plie. Is that, if I remember that correctly? But where the spinal movement, which reminded me again a bit of the Yomvalu in Catherine Dunham's work and the whole Haitian connection. And of course, Ananya Chatterjea does mention Dahomey. She mentions that there's the whole knot. But I was thinking of all that. And of course, when that history intrudes into this erect spine posture, you have, I think, a radical juxtaposition there, which is also genital pollution. But while they are not incongruous in an unaesthetic way, it's calling for a new aesthetics. It's calling for a new frame for us to appreciate what's going on. And it's a new discussion. So I really feel that these concepts worked very well for me in trying to understand what is the way in which we put these artists together to then start thinking about how they connect. So that's really my response to carrying on this conversation. But the funk must remain and the heat must remain. We can't let go of those ideas. So let's not forget them.
Ananya, yes, there you are. What are you thinking?
I'm thinking of the ways in which we think about making change, because my whole project was to pull the field of dance, of contemporary dance, which is sometimes feels it's held hostage by ideas we've inherited and that we might no longer care for, actually. Is change only made from outside, or can we make change from inside? And I'm fond of, because I'm from Kolkata, the other Ananya will appreciate this also. I am so familiar with the work of termites, where you go to pick up a box and they've eaten it all the way from inside. And that's, this eating from inside is quite something. So I think about because my own artistic path has been, okay, I'm gonna create something that is entirely outside of quote unquote Western dance influence. I don't have that training, but that's also my path. But Mama Germaine reminds us that we can go in and change it from within, so much so that it changes, it's entirely different. I also think of, I also had talked about a different version of this in Jaole Villaggio Zolar's work in my first book. And I want to give her a shout out because that amazing work that this person and Urban Bush Women have done throughout the years is so significant. Now that she does this choreographic institute, so there's a choreographic institute, but imagined in so many different ways and actualized through so many different a network of connectivities across for artists, that it completely undoes the ways in which other the way in which the concept exists inside mainstream dance culture. So this, the radical juxtaposition and the pollution, as I think, as you point out, they're actually connected, polluting from within through that kind of radical juxtaposition. And difference then is the key that brings us all together.
It is something that the book brings forward, that variegation and alterity. Alterity is actually in the title, that difference is the thing that actually can help us imagine, forward is where we want to go, but maybe an alongsideness or an amongness. And to get to that place of amongness, we have to figure out how to appreciate difference as it's, as a kind of like destiny of creativity and spiritual practice and of obviously art making and dance, like the ways that we are coming from different points of view, if you will, or understandings of self or family, chosen family, intentionality, social possibility. It matters that we have otherwise ways of being among each other. Ananya, before we go back to our panelists, what else did you hear that surprised you in terms of thinking about your work? Can you say something about your response to the offerings that have been given so far?
Yes. I really was struck with, first of all, Douglas Kearney's, the way in which he pulled in the funk. It just put me back in my body because I remember why I started to write this book and why it took me so many years, because it funked me out, these experiences. It came from that experience. And it was so blue that it took me time to get out of that, but it was also incredibly about the creative flow. And I was like, of course, that's the place where the creative flow begins. Like, it's from that, I understood that incredible journey that you have to go from the funk to the fire. And my namesake, Ananya Kabir's beautifully astute observation that the journeys of the Atlantic and the Indian Ocean are different, and I think she said they mark our convergence and our divergences. That's right. That is exactly right. That's how, and I thought about the way in which I worked through Sarah Ahmed's notion of actually difference as the glue among all of us. I'll also say, I was okay when Alessandra talks about putting it in practice. I hadn't she's drawing me into a future that I hadn't seen yet. So these are all provocations that are like pulling me across time and place. And I feel very multi-planar right now, multiple planes of time and space right now.
Well, that makes a lot of sense based on the theorists and thinkers that we've gathered together for this event. I wonder if we can go back to our guests, if you will, since I'm moderating. I feel like a host of some sort, and talk about this concept of time and differentiation in terms of address. So Professor Kabir was taking us to thinking about Atlantic and Asiatic, like oceans meeting, and then Ananya Chatterjea, you're thinking about being multiplanar. So this question of kind of time and queer time is something we might be super concerned with. It shows up in this text. But how are you thinking of time and creativity along these axes of South-South feminist possibilities? So I wonder if the three panelists could each weigh in on this kind of array. Let's start with you, Professor Williams. Thank you.
Yeah, I think I've been thinking about time in terms of grounding. And so something that Heat and Alterity does is to ground us in Black feminism and the essential value of the Combahee River Collective. And that in order to understand the South-South axis, that in fact, those intersections of multiple oppressions that was theorized so clearly in the Black feminist statement, that is essential, that we bring that into the present, and that we understand how our coming together as artists of the South-South is rooted in understanding how those multiple oppressions are living in us and living among us. And I think that is something that I'm holding on as central to how that South-South axis functions and operates.
Professor Kabir?
I mean, for me, actually, dance is such an incredibly productive way to think about temporality, especially because I'm a literary scholar by training. And while all cultural productions obviously engage with issues of temporality and how we experience time and how we are led to think about time, the way dance as an embodied practice, makes us do that is so different that it's one of the things that actually drew me to wanting to think myself about dance. So I think the way in which, again, we are told in a very detailed way, particularly each chapter, begins with these kind of descriptions, which remind you of field notes or something like, they're in situ. So we are in that, we are drawn into that space of performance. And in as much as the written word can do, it kind of short circuits that distance, between seeing and experiencing and being described something. So I think this was a very good tactic, which helped us get, almost get into the time of that performance, and move in time with the artist. So I think that was really very important. And then, of course, it's a question, I think, of taking the task of decolonization by making us think about time itself differently, not just think, actually feel time itself differently. I think that's really important. Again, being a literary scholar, sometimes I have to catch myself. I say, no, it's not about thinking. It's not about ratiocination and argumentation. It's about actually what am I feeling in my body? So it's incredibly helpful, again, to get those descriptions very, not descriptive, actually, get an analytical
I know that they'll be back in just a moment. And while they come back, because we always have connectivity questions, we have questions of access, we have questions.
I'm back. I think I'm back.
Okay.
But I hope I wasn't
please.
much. I mean, I really, as I said, for me, the whole the engagement with time is really an invitation to decolonize the body, and because we have the difference here, there's no attempt to make us feel that we must all decolonize to the same beat, if you see what I mean. But again, taking the very fruitful understanding of polyrhythm here from African heritage dance practices, I think that is one thing that a lot of us can learn from other parts of the world, which engage with temporality differently in terms of rhythm and movement. I think that idea of polyrhythm is extremely important to help us deliberately fragment ourselves into a mess, and then engage in that whole process of stepping differently into time. So each and every chapter in the book, I think, really helps us. But because, again, we get that emphasis on how is it done in the earlier chapters, the emphasis on footwork, and of course the whole idea of heat, I think that really the phenomenology of it all helps us kind of really get it, not just read about it, but really get it. So that's what I would say about how time speaks to me in this book.
Beautiful. And I can tell, Professor Kearney, you have some offering for us. We'd be glad to hear it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Just really picking up on what Professor Kabir was talking about in terms of polyrhythm. And one of the places that I really want to locate a close reading of temporality is in the Nora Chipaumire section, when we're working with this sort of one signature of time by referencing, historically performed pieces, whether the relationship to Swan or the rite of spring, and so you have that indication of time, right? But simultaneously, you have the new vocabulary of movement. And I say new not as a way of kind of going, that makes it great. I say new just in a way of creating a productive difference that Chipaumire brings into that space. But then there's yet another time signature sort of shift through what Professor Chatterjea calls the repetition with difference, which is very similar to the idea like repetition and revision that is oftentimes used in jazz or blues, to kind of build, but then recursively shift what was built upon. And in this particular sense, this third signature of time also becomes a signature of place, because when Professor Chatterjea has the piece of Dark Swan performed by different dancers, by taking into account the different subjectivities, the different gender identifications, the different forms of sort of visual identification of the dancers, Chipaumire then revises something that has already existed twice, in a sense that time and space then shift. And this is something that Professor Chatterjee points out as being essential to this task of doing more than just sort of going back or adding a different set of languages or terms to an existing piece. That the shifting of the dancers requiring different attitudes of choreography then creates a kind of specificity that is both temporal. This isn't what we did before. This is what we're doing now. And spatial, in the sense of this is no longer in the same place. And yet the performers are performing in the same place in the sense of the context of the piece. So for me, that term of polyrhythm as a concept that then becomes truly kind of cross-disciplinary in terms of not only the feeling, but the thinking is a really fantastic example of how time is brought into this piece, this book.
This is lovely, and this conversation across the three of you has also turned us towards this question of place. And Ananya Chatterjee, I mean, you started with an embodied acknowledgement for our work together today, which was, of course, absolutely lovely, but also reminds us that where we dance matters. And I'm wondering now about where you are. And I asked that question in full sense of Vimeo and Facebook and YouTube. You know, we're engaging this event through cameras on computer screens. So this question of where we dance becomes literalized in unexpected ways in 2021. But where are you? So if we have a sense of when we are, which is quite diverse and unfolding and nonlinear, of course, we hope, and finding its way, where are you and where do you want to be? As an artist, as a thinker, as a maker, what is the world that you're making and moving, I assume and hope, all of us towards? I'd like to go with you and dance with you there. Where is it?
You know, this notion of the global stage, right? I have recently found, since the uprising of 2020 in the Twin Cities, that the global stage is here on the streets, on Lake Street, where I was, you know, invited by amazing activists to perform or to offer dance as a protest against the forced sterilization of immigrant women. It is at Line 3 where I will be inviting my students later this semester, and the artists of my company to come, show up, offer dance. So I am asking always, where do I dance from? Which body do I dance from? So emotionally, spiritually, and physically. So always, and I feel that the planarness, the interplanal or interdimensionalness is the realness of that. I think I have to, as a social justice artist, I feel I have to dance I have to remember that my footwork is in service of. So that immediately puts me in multiple places at the same time. And I think when I think of the tremendous efforts that these artists are always shining the light on, it reminds me of the multiple places we can be at all times. And I'm really, in my mind, I'm so remembering the tremendous article that Alice Sheppard published in New York Times. I dance, where she's reminding us she danced because she loves it. She loves it. And that love places us in multiple, in the multiplicity of dance that she brings forward. Immediately, her love for it widens what dance is or what dance can be. It turns the world of dance upside down. It shows us the kind of systemic hierarchies that have become lodged, and they fall apart with her love. That's where I'm at.
Wow, so should we all be in that place. You had wanted to acknowledge Alice Sheppard, who we hope is on this call, and maybe some other people as well. Can you do that now?
Yeah, I wanted to thank Alice Sheppard and Rulan Tangen, who are part of this call. I know that those two are here. I know Nora tried to stay awake, but she's not here, so she's in Senegal and it's late. I'm not sure who else is on the call. I also want to thank, as Carl already did, my editors without whom this book would not have been written. Really, Rachel Fensham made sure I finished the book. So thank you, Rachel, and thank you, Kate, for your incredible support of this process.
That's beautiful. We're not quite wrapped up, so don't take that as a kind of outro. Because I did want to turn to this question that you raised just a moment ago with your mic drop. And I think many of us on this call have spent time with Ananya Chatterjea and understand that there are many mic drops in almost every encounter where the truth and value of a statement as being a pivot towards a really necessary reorientation is enabled and enlivened. So you mentioned something about your footwork being in service. So I'd like to turn to this question of service in art making. It's a really important question, especially for those of us who identify as artists of color, BIPOC artists of color, well, BIPOC artists, and also folks who align with Black Lives and Black Loves, which are, of course, super urgent in my own sort of concerns. We make art and research and publish because we want to be in service towards or to a something else and allow a something else to emerge that we know we need. And Jose Esteban Munoz had many ways to help us think about that. Audre Lorde had many ways to help us think about that. Let's turn to our panelists first, and let's hear from each of you, if you don't mind, towards this question of service and art making. Everyone on this call who are on the panel are artists in our own ways. Professor Kabir, obviously, you're quite a talented and gifted researcher and artist of storytelling, bringing narratives, historical narratives and interpretation to the fore. What is your work in service towards? And so this is a question for all three of you. And what do you hope that a publication like Ananya's text could help us reorient towards in terms of service and art making?
Yes, it's such an important question because in a way, of course, many of you are dancers as well as dance scholars. Someone like me has been trained with the written word, and of course, we dance. And I, as I said, I mean, when I did my project on dance, I was dancing. Obviously, never that good to be on stage, but I needed to feel the dance to be able to dance it. So in that sense, I did learn, and a book like the one we are talking about today reminds us of the necessity to bring the body back into the conversation, you know, one way or the other. In fact, as we are in these 3 weeks, semester's just begun, I'm doing a workshop, 3-week workshop with our MA students at King's, where I was asked to teach them advanced dissertation writing skills. And my topic was working with the body, you know. And so it's kind of in my head. What do I do? How do I convey to students who are trained in literary studies that they must nevertheless look and consider and feel about their own bodies as well as others? So, you know, I think this is, and to do that is automatically, I think, to be in service of, at least I speak for myself as a South Asian woman, of privilege, you know. Yes, I am a person of color, but I'm also a person of privilege. So everything that I've learned to become professor of English literature at King's College London has actually come from a place of privilege. Of course, I've worked hard and I've done, you know, all the things that one needs to do, but I can't deny that my starting point was somewhere, and it was there because even ancestrally, my ancestors were somewhere and others weren't there, you know. So I have to remember that there was some kind of complicity, some kind of collaboration that went into making me what I am. And so when I do what I do, which is trying to write the different kinds of things, to write differently, to think differently, to do academic work differently. I am trying to do it in service of all those people who were marginalized at every moment where my ancestors were not, if you see what I mean. So I want to use my work to be in the service of those who descended from those who were probably in a position of marginalization vis-a-vis my own heritage and my own ancestry. So I want to keep that relationality there. And every time I feel that I'm being marginalized myself, I have to think of a relationality that has given me privilege in some other position. So I want to be in service of always remembering that and acknowledging those that keep me on my toes so that I remember that. So that's what I'd say.
Beautiful, beautiful. To be in service of remembering and providing access and possibilities. Professor Kearney, thank you.
I mean, I want to go back to the beginning of the event where Professor Williams pointed out in her discussion of the book, there was a call to action. Like the book feels like it is calling us to serve and providing us with a means of serving. And I'm also thinking about when Professor Chatterjea points out Gerald Visner and the notion of survivance, and I'll just quote from the book, in Native communities as active presencing inherently linked to liberation from colonial containment. And I think that the idea of active presencing is important. As I read this text, there's a whole set of notes that are just about how can you work meaningfully with integrity and actual possibility of actual change and transformation in an organization, say a university. And by taking so many of the ideas that Professor Chatterjea is bringing and thinking through them and working through them. So to me, there's service as an artist to make sure that one creates spaces and is present and creates presence that are active and not simply sort of tokenized. But then there's this other way that the book becomes it's a playbook for how to make, for how to endeavor to begin moving forward on decolonizing spaces.
Beautiful. Emergent strategies in dance scholarship. Yes, please. Playbook. Yes, please. Thank you for that. Yes. Professor Williams, thank you.
Yes. I think that Heat and Alterity is calling us to be in the service of continuous ongoing critique. And, there are so many examples. Placement of two Black bodies on stage. What is the meaning of that placement? When we as Black artists engage in experimental work at the expense of Black people, what is that about? When we as artists who are grounded in cultural specificities, such as the lowly Tabata foot, and it becomes something else, it becomes a balletic foot, what are we doing and why are we making those decisions? When we go and observe contemporary dance, and Ananya offers us so many examples of her extensive work in the field of observing contemporary dance with detail, that we're not just going to see contemporary dance to acknowledge its beauty, but we're there to be critically aware of when those beautiful dances lean towards cultural appropriation and acknowledging and recognizing that. And so I think that there's a readiness to be so engaged in criticality that is a part of the work of Heat.
Oh my goodness, so fantastic. Yes, thank you. We can always tell artists who have worked with you, Ananya, because as Professor Kearney demonstrated, the mic drop yet again. Jose Munoz ends his incredible work, Cruising Utopia, with the line, through shared critical dissatisfaction, we engage collective potentiality. And I think there's an echo of this idea here because that idea has always been here. And Ananya Chatterjea, through your work, your creative work, your work as a partner and a friend and a parent and a lover and a maker and a thinker and a writer and so many identities, a sister and a pal, you bring this kind of critical possibility to our shared spaces. We're kind of here where we are. What do you want to tell us now?
First of all, thank you, Tommy. First of all, I want to say hi, Nora. I hear that Nora did stay awake, and I love her. Nora and I have spent so much time in what I call co-rantings on the phone that sometimes the phones would get hot in my ear because we were both speaking with so much fire about shared frustrations, but also what does it mean, how can we find ourselves in the same place, in multiple ways. This is important. So I love you, Nora, and thank you for being here. I wanted to say that I think my whole intention was to pull the field to a different place, to imagine innovation differently, not for its own cold sake, but because dance makes so much meaning. It makes so much meaning in so many different ways and so many particular ways that we might not see in other articulations. I love dance, like Alice, I love dance. And I believe so strongly in its ability to make meaning through metaphor, as Douglas reminded us, yes. So I love the metaphoric, imagistic, visceral, soul-stirring meaning-making in dance. And at the same time, I want to say, there is a way in which we need to see all of these different ways in which dance is happening so that the field can feel all the artists chafing against the boundaries that have been put in. The boundaries or the borders have been put in service of something. And those are violent, right? So how can the field itself see the different kinds of meaning being made and enjoy that beauty? Because partly the tension in writing the book was both about dismantling, and I talk about, I try to balance that in chapter 2 and 3, how the dismantling happens. There's so much being made, so much world making happening in a completely decolonial way. Yeah.
We make the worlds we need to live in. We make them whether we are allowed to. And Ananya, you keep demonstrating this to us all. We make them whether we're invited to. We make them because we have to. We thank you for this work. If you don't have this book and you are on this call, what is wrong with you? We're going to post an order form, of course. You need to have it in your hand. We thank the panelists. We thank Professor Chatterjea especially. We thank the ancestors who make it possible for us to meet. And we share the ideas that Ananya just brought us now, love and beauty. These are components of our critical dissatisfaction, our criticality, and through honoring our differences, through our aspects of love and beauty as sisterhood, please, please, yes, again and again and again. Thank you, Ananya. We love you.
Incredible colleagues.
Thank you, everyone.
U of M as well. Thank you.